Nobody believed the dog until the vault door blew inward in a sheet of flame, and by then it was almost too late to matter. But on the morning this story begins, the only thing anyone noticed about Daniel Reyes and his dog was the smell, and the laughter that followed a block behind them wherever they walked. Daniel had learned, over 3 years on the streets of Charleston, exactly which kinds of laughter to ignore and which ones meant trouble was coming. The laughter outside the first Palmetto Trust that morning was the harmless kind, two men in suits, coffee cups in hand, nudging each other and grinning at the sight of a scarred, one-eared dog planted like a fence post on the sidewalk in front of the bank's brass doors, refusing to move, nose pointed at the ground like it had found the last bone on earth. "Somebody call animal control," one of the suits said, not unkindly, just careless, the way men say things about people and dogs they've already decided don't matter. Or maybe the bomb squad. Look at him, dead serious about a crack in the sidewalk. Daniel didn't laugh. He'd learned, months ago, that when Duke went still like that, belly low, tail flat, nose locked onto one exact point in the world like it was the only thing left worth caring about, something was true, even when nobody else could see it yet. He was 34 years old, though the years on the street had etched another decade onto his face that his birth certificate didn't account for. He'd spent 9 of those years as an Army staff sergeant, an explosive ordnance disposal technician who had walked toward the things other men ran from, until an IED outside Kandahar in his second deployment had taken most of the hearing in his left ear, and left him with a tremor in his right hand that showed up worst when he was tired or hungry or both, which by now was most of the time. He lived, if you could call it living, out of a green canvas backpack and a spot beneath the overpass on Meeting Street, where the concrete stayed dry even when the rain came sideways off the harbor. He ate what the shelter kitchen served on the days he made it there before the line closed, and what he could scrounge from behind the diner on Calhoun on the days he didn't. His hand shook worst in the mornings, before the coffee, before the first cigarette he could never quite manage to quit, and some mornings it shook so bad he had to sit on the curb with both hands jammed under his thighs just to keep from drawing stares. The overpass spot had its own particular geography, learned over 3 winters the way a man learns any hostile terrain, which section of concrete stayed driest, which angle blocked the worst of the wind coming up off the water, which storm drain flooded first and had to be avoided after a hard rain. He kept his few possessions arranged with a precision that would have looked, to anyone who noticed, almost military, boots always facing the same direction, ready to be pulled on in seconds, the one blanket folded into thirds each morning, a half-empty bottle of water kept within arm's reach at all times, an old habit from a career spent never being more than a few feet from resupply. Other men under other overpasses called him particular, called him stiff, and Daniel let them, because he'd learned a long time ago that the habits keeping him alive didn't need anyone else's approval to be worth keeping. He'd tried the shelters at first, in that first hard year after the divorce, but the noise of 40 men sleeping in one room, the fluorescent lights that never fully went dark, the sudden shouted arguments that could erupt over nothing at 3 in the morning, had proven worse for his nerves than the cold ever was. He'd learned the hard way that a locked door in a room full of strangers could feel more dangerous to his particular wiring than an open concrete underpass with nothing but the harbor wind for company. It wasn't pride that kept him under the bridge. It was survival, plain and simple, the same calculation that had once kept him alive walking toward the things other men ran from. The Army had given him a medical discharge with a stack of paperwork 3 inches thick and a monthly disability check that arrived, when it arrived at all, about 60% of what the VA's own regulations said he was owed, a clerical error, they told him, the same clerical error they'd been promising to fix for going on 2 years, while Daniel's rent, his marriage, and eventually his apartment had all come apart at roughly the same pace the paperwork refused to move. He didn't tell people about Kandahar. He didn't tell people about the 26 seconds between the detonation and the moment he understood he was still alive, staring up at a sky gone the wrong color, ears ringing so loud he couldn't hear his own team screaming his name. He kept that inside a locked box in his chest, the way he kept most things now, and he moved through the city the way he'd once moved through hostile terrain, cautious, watchful, always aware of the exits. Duke had found him 3 months ago, on a night colder than Charleston had any right to be, curled into the lee of a dumpster behind a shuttered restaurant, so still Daniel had almost mistaken him for dead. One ear was missing entirely, sheared clean off in some old, healed wound. His left flank carried a wide, hairless scar in a shape too regular to be anything but deliberate, an old burn, Daniel had thought even then, the same shape burns leave on a man standing too close to something that goes off wrong. He'd almost walked past. He had exactly one blanket and barely enough food for himself most nights, and adding a half-dead dog to that equation felt like inviting a second failure into a life already buckling under the weight of the first. But the dog had opened one eye, just the one, the other permanently clouded and blind, and made a low sound, not quite a whimper, not quite a word, and Daniel had stopped walking. "You and me both, buddy," he'd said, and sat down in the cold beside him, and that had been that. Now, 3 months later, standing in front of a bank that had never done anything to either of them, Duke refused to move, and the two men in suits laughed, and Daniel Reyes felt the old, familiar prickle at the back of his neck that had once meant, in another life, in another country, that something was about to go very wrong. Duke had come into Daniel's life the way most important things in a broken man's life arrive, small, unremarkable, almost missed entirely. That first night behind the dumpster, Daniel had shared half a cold hamburger with him, not because he had much to spare, but because it was the only thing he had, and something about the dog's stillness had felt less like begging and more like waiting, patient in a way that reminded Daniel uncomfortably of himself. "Don't get used to this," Daniel had told him that first night, sliding the last bite across the cardboard he'd been using as a ground sheet. "I got nothing to offer you, less than nothing most days." The dog had eaten slow, careful, rationing each bite the way a man rations water in a desert, and Daniel had recognized that too, because he did the exact same thing with his own meals now. Some habit of scarcity burned so deep into both of them that abundance, when it came at all, felt suspicious rather than welcome. For the first week, the dog kept a careful 3 feet of distance at all times, sleeping close enough to share warmth but never close enough to be touched without warning. Daniel didn't push it. He tried, more than once, to shoo him off entirely, telling himself it was the responsible thing to do. "Go on now," he said on the third morning, gesturing vaguely down the street toward nothing in particular. "Go find somebody with an actual roof. I can't be responsible for you. I can barely be responsible for me." The dog had simply looked at him, unmoved, unbothered, the same steady patience he'd shown from the very first night, and settled back down onto the cardboard 3 feet away as if Daniel hadn't spoken at all. "You're a stubborn one," Daniel muttered, and found, despite himself, that some small part of him was relieved the dog hadn't listened. By the 5th day, Daniel had started leaving a portion of whatever he scrounged specifically for the dog, no longer pretending it was accidental generosity. He caught himself, more than once, talking to him the way lonely men talk to anything that will hold still and listen, not expecting an answer, just needing the sound of his own voice bouncing back off something warm and alive instead of concrete and silence. "You got a name somewhere under all that fur?" Daniel asked one gray morning, watching the dog watch a delivery truck rumble past with the wary intensity of something cataloging a threat. The dog didn't answer, not in any way Daniel could translate yet, but he noticed, that same morning, a small brass tag buried deep in the matted fur at his throat, worn nearly smooth, and when he finally worked up the nerve to check it, 3 days later, he found a single word stamped into the metal, along with a partial serial number gone illegible with age. Dog. Duke, Daniel repeated, testing the word. The dog's ear, the one he had left, swiveled toward the sound, and something in his posture shifted, some old muscle memory answering to a name he hadn't heard spoken aloud in longer than either of them could guess. All right, Duke, guess that settles that. He tried once more in a half-hearted way to talk himself out of the growing attachment. This is a bad idea, he told the dog, more to himself than anything. I can't feed myself half the time. I sleep under a bridge. You deserve better than what I've got to give you. Duke, in response, simply pressed himself a few inches closer along the cardboard, closing the careful 3-foot gap by half, and Daniel understood with a kind "oh." Resigned affection he hadn't expected to feel again, that the decision had already been made without either of them formally agreeing to it. The weeks that followed built themselves slowly into something Daniel hadn't expected to find again on the street, a routine, threadbare and fragile, but a routine all the same. Duke wouldn't eat unless Daniel ate first, some old training or old trauma insisting the alpha fed before the follower did. Duke flinched hard at sudden loud noises, a truck backfiring, a dropped trash can lid, the distant crack of a nail gun on a construction site 3 blocks over, dropping flat to the pavement, ears pinned, body rigid, in a way that mirrored, almost exactly, the way Daniel's own body still betrayed him at the sound of anything sharp and sudden. Yeah, Daniel murmured the first time he caught the parallel, sitting on the curb with one hand resting on Duke's heaving side, while a jackhammer 2 streets over rattled them both. I know exactly what that's like. Duke developed over those first weeks a habit that Daniel came to think of as his tell. Whenever Daniel went quiet too long, whenever his eyes drifted somewhere far away and his jaw tightened around a memory he hadn't invited, Duke would press his nose hard once against the inside of Daniel's wrist, right over the pulse point, and hold it there until Daniel's breathing evened back out. It wasn't affection, exactly, not at first. It looked to Daniel's trained eye like something closer to a medic's hand checking a pulse, an old reflex from a job Daniel didn't yet understand the shape of. You keep doing that, Daniel said one evening, like you're checking if I'm still in one piece. Duke pressed his nose against the wrist again, right on cue, and held it there a beat longer than usual, and Daniel felt something in his chest crack open just slightly, the way ice cracks before it finally gives way to water underneath. Mornings were the hardest part of any day on the street, and Daniel found, over those first weeks, that having Duke beside him changed the shape of that difficulty without erasing it. He still woke most days with his right hand trembling too badly to hold a coffee cup steady, still had to sit with both hands jammed under his thighs until the shaking settled enough to function. But now there was a warm weight pressed against his side while he waited it out, a steady heartbeat under his palm that gave him something to focus on besides the tremor itself. You ever get tired of babysitting a grown man who can't hold his own coffee? Daniel asked one gray morning, voice rough with disuse, watching his hand shake against his knee. Duke lifted his head from where it rested against Daniel's thigh, gave him a long, unblinking look out of his one good eye, and huffed once through his nose, not quite an answer, but close enough to feel like one. He learned Duke's habits the way a man learns a new language under duress, by immersion, by getting things wrong before getting them right. Duke wouldn't tolerate anyone reaching for his collar from above, some old memory buried in that reflex that made him flinch and duck away, even from Daniel's gentlest touch. But he'd lean his whole weight into a slow scratch along the ribs like it was the only comfort he'd ever been offered honestly. He hated the sound of car alarms, went rigid and flat at the first electronic wail from 3 blocks over, and Daniel learned to steer their walking routes around the parking garage on Meeting Street after the second time he watched Duke's whole body seize up at a sound that, to anyone else, would have been nothing more than city noise. About 2 weeks in, Daniel noticed Duke favoring his front left paw on their morning walk, a hitch in his stride that hadn't been there the day before. He got him settled on the flattened cardboard beneath the overpass and lifted the paw carefully, palm open, moving slow enough that Duke could pull away if he needed to. Wedged deep between the pads was a shard of green glass, old and jagged, worked in from some broken bottle on a sidewalk that had probably cut him blocks before Daniel ever noticed the limp. "This is gonna hurt worse before it stops hurting," Daniel murmured, working a pair of tweezers he kept in his pack for exactly this kind of improvised first aid, the same kind of blunt honesty he used to give young privates before pulling shrapnel. "I'm not gonna pretend otherwise." Duke's whole body went rigid, a low growl building deep in his chest, but he didn't pull the paw away, didn't so much as flinch toward a bite, just held himself perfectly still with his one good eye fixed somewhere past Daniel's shoulder, enduring rather than accepting, the same thousand-yard stare Daniel recognized from his own face in cracked gas station mirrors on his worst mornings. "Almost there," Daniel said, voice low and even, working the glass free in one careful motion. "Almost there, you're all right." "You're all right." The shard came free with a small bead of blood following it, and Daniel cleaned the wound as best he could with a splash of bottled water and a strip of clean cloth torn from an undershirt he didn't have many of to spare, wrapping the paw with the same care he'd have given a fellow soldier's field dressing. When it was done, Duke let out a long, shuddering breath, and for the first time since Daniel had found him, rolled fully onto his side in the open, exposing the pale, vulnerable stretch of his belly to a man he'd known barely 2 weeks. Daniel sat very still and let him. Some offers a man doesn't interrupt. "Okay," he said quietly, throat tighter than he expected. "Okay, I hear you." There was a night, 5 weeks into their partnership, when a summer thunderstorm rolled in hard off the harbor, lightning cracking close enough to light up the underpass like daylight, and Duke came apart at the seams in a way Daniel hadn't seen from him before. He scrambled backward into the deepest corner of their concrete shelter, panting hard, body trembling in long full shudders, eyes wide and fixed on something that wasn't there, some memory of a different explosion in a different place that the thunder had dragged screaming back to the surface. Daniel didn't reach for him right away. He'd learned enough about his own flashbacks to know that hands, even careful ones, could feel like an ambush to a mind trapped somewhere else entirely. Instead, he sat down a few feet away, back against the cold concrete, and started talking, low and even, the same steady cadence he used to use talking a rattled private through a convoy ambush. "It's just weather," he said, "just noise and light. Nothing's coming through that's gonna hurt you. You're not there anymore, wherever there was. You're here, with me. You're safe." He kept saying it, the words mattering less than the steadiness carrying them, until slowly, in increments too small to name, Duke's breathing began to even out, the shutters spacing further apart, until at last he crept the remaining distance across the concrete on his belly and pressed himself hard against Daniel's side. And they sat like that together until the storm rolled off toward the coast and the rain gentled into something almost peaceful against the overpass above them. "Yeah," Daniel said quietly into the dark, one hand resting flat against Duke's ribs, feeling the heartbeat slow beneath his palm. "I know exactly what that's like. Wish to God I didn't, but I do." Not every day carried that kind of weight. Some of it was almost funny, in the dry, understated way that seemed to be the only humor either of them had left. Duke developed an early and total disdain for a particular pigeon that roosted on the overpass ledge above their spot, a fat, arrogant bird that dropped debris on them with what Daniel swore was deliberate malice, and Duke would fix it with a look of such profound, wounded judgment that Daniel found himself laughing out loud the first time he caught it, a real laugh, unfamiliar, and a little painful in his chest from disuse. You survived a war and you're out here holding a grudge against a pigeon, Daniel said, wiping his eyes. That checks out, actually. That tracks completely. Duke didn't dignify that with his usual huff. He just gave the pigeon one more look of icy contempt and turned his back on it entirely, which somehow made the whole thing funnier. Daniel also learned, through trial and error, that Duke had opinions about food he'd never expected from a dog who'd once been half-starved enough to eat anything offered. He turned his nose up consistently at the greasy diner scraps Daniel sometimes managed to scrounge, but would eat a plain piece of bread with something like genuine gratitude, and Daniel started saving the bread from shelter meals specifically for him, a small, deliberate act of care that felt, each time, like practicing being a decent man again after years of believing he'd forgotten how. There were harder days, too. A week or so into their routine, walking past a construction site on Calhoun, a pneumatic nail gun fired off in a rapid burst just as they passed, and Duke dropped flat to the sidewalk mid-stride, legs splayed, whole body rigid, eyes wide and unseeing in the exact same way Daniel's own eyes went when a car backfired too close behind him. Daniel crouched down immediately, not touching, just present, voice low. Easy, easy, Duke, just noise. Nothing's coming, you're not there, you're here with me. It took nearly a full minute, the construction crew glancing over with mild curiosity before losing interest and going back to work, before Duke's body finally unlocked and he climbed back to his feet, shame-faced in that particular way dogs manage without any human vocabulary at all, pressing hard against Daniel's leg, as if apologizing for something neither of them could help. Don't you dare feel bad about that, Daniel told him, scratching hard. Behind his one good ear. I've hit the deck over a car door slamming. We don't apologize for the wiring the war left behind. We just work around it best we can. Feeding time by the 5th week had become something close to a small ceremony between them. Whatever Daniel had, a shelter meal, scavenged bread, a hot dog from a street vendor who'd started slipping him day-old ones for free, got split evenly, always, Duke waiting with a patience that bordered on ceremonial until Daniel said the same 2 words every time. Go on. Only then would Duke eat, slow and deliberate, no trace left of the desperate, starved gulping from that first night behind the dumpster, replaced now by something that looked, unmistakably, like trust hard-won and carefully kept. Daniel found himself, more nights than he could count in those first 2 months, sitting under the overpass with Duke's head heavy across his lap, watching the traffic lights cycle red and green over an empty intersection, and thinking that whatever else the world had taken from him, the marriage, the apartment, most of the hearing in his left ear, the steady hand he used to have, it had, against every reasonable expectation, handed him something worth protecting in return. You didn't have to stop for me that night, he said to Duke once, voice rough in the dark. Out of every dumpster in this whole city, you picked mine. I don't know why, but I'm glad you did. Duke made his low sound, soft and satisfied, and pressed his head harder into Daniel's palm, and for a little while neither of them thought about bank vaults, or vice presidents, or federal audits, or anything at all beyond the simple animal comfort of 2 broken things leaning on each other under a bridge in the dark. The reveal of what Duke actually was came almost by accident, 3 weeks into their strange new partnership, on a night Daniel had ducked into the public library on King Street to escape a downpour, and out of habit more than hope, used one of the free computer terminals to look up the serial number stamped on that brass tag. The library was warm in a way the overpass never was, and Daniel had let himself linger longer than strictly necessary, savoring the dry heat and the quiet hum of the building's old radiators. Duke curled patiently at his feet beneath the terminal desk, while a librarian 2 computers down pretended not to notice the smell of the street clinging to both of them. Daniel had learned over 3 years exactly which librarians would let him stay past the polite glance, and which ones would find a reason to ask him to move along. And this particular branch, this particular Tuesday evening librarian, had always been one of the kind ones. He typed the partial serial number into 3 different search engines before he found the right combination of words to lead him anywhere useful. A veterans outreach forum, where someone had once posted about tracking down a retired military working dog through similarly fragmented tag information. He left a message in the forum, half expecting nothing to come of it, the way half of everything he tried these days came to nothing, and was startled 2 days later when his disposable phone buzzed with a callback from a number he didn't recognize. It took some digging, a few false starts, an email to a veterans outreach organization that connected him, eventually, to a woman named Colonel Bet Ackafer, retired, who had once run military working dog operations out of a joint base in North Carolina, and now volunteered her evenings tracking down records for exactly this kind of long-shot inquiry. She called him back 2 days later, on the library's borrowed phone number, her voice brisk and professional in a way that made Daniel straighten up out of old habit despite the years since he'd last taken orders from anyone. "Sergeant Reyes," she said, "I ran your number. Took some doing. A lot of that database is fragmented from the transition a few years back, but I think I've got your dog." "Yes, ma'am." Designation Duke, assigned originally to a specialized explosive detection unit, cross-trained for structural search work, vaults, safes, reinforced storage, the kind of environments regular detection dogs aren't built to work in. Deployed twice, once overseas and once, interestingly, on a stateside assignment supporting a joint task force on financial crime, sniffing out explosive devices planted in secure facilities during a string of coordinated bank robberies about 6 years back. Handler retired out due to injury. Dog was slated for retirement and adoption through the usual program, but the paperwork shows him listed as unaccounted for during a transport reassignment. Far as the Army's concerned, that dog's been missing for going on 4 years. Daniel looked down at Duke, curled against his leg on the library floor, one ear gone, one eye clouded white, a creature that had somehow survived 4 years of whatever had happened to him. Since that transport reassignment fell apart and felt the same slow, cold recognition he imagined Duke felt every time a truck backfired too close. "Bank vaults," Daniel repeated slowly. He was trained on bank vaults. "Structural search, financial crime task force support, yes." Ackafer's voice sharpened, some old instinct of her own coming alert. "Why do you ask, Sergeant?" Daniel didn't answer that right away. Out the library window, 3 blocks distant, he could just make out the brass doors of the First Palmetto Trust, the same doors Duke had planted himself in front of, twice now in the last week, refusing to budge no matter how hard Daniel tugged the leash, nose locked on some invisible point in the sidewalk that Daniel had, until this exact moment, chalked up to nothing more than a stray scent trail from a dropped hot dog. "No reason," he said finally, "just curious what kind of dog I ended up with." But he was lying, and some part of him had already started, quietly, methodically, the way he used to before a clearance operation, to pay very close attention indeed. That night, lying awake on the flattened cardboard that served as his bed under the overpass, Daniel let himself think, fully and without flinching, about the betrayal that had put him there in the first place, not just the VA's clerical error, though that was real enough and had cost him thousands of dollars a year for going on 2 years now, but the specific man behind it, a claims processor named Aaron Voigt, who Daniel had spoken to a dozen times over the phone, always polite. Always apologetic, always promising the correction was in the pipeline, while month after month the underpaid check kept arriving, and Daniel's marriage, his apartment, and eventually his sense of himself as a man who could still provide for anything, had all come apart at roughly the same slow, grinding pace. He didn't hate Voigt, not exactly. Hate took more energy than Daniel had left most days. But he understood, lying there in the dark with a rescued military dog breathing steady beside him, that the two of them, man and dog, had both been failed by systems built to protect them, chewed up by paperwork and bureaucracy, and men who'd stopped seeing either of them as anything but a case number a long time ago. And he understood, too, that whatever was happening beneath that bank might be the first thing in years he could actually fight, instead of just enduring. "We're gonna figure this out," he told Duke quietly. "Both of us, whatever's down there and whatever's still broken in the two of us." Duke's tail thumped once against the cardboard, soft and slow, and for the first time since Daniel had found him, he fell asleep stretched fully flat on his side rather than curled tight and watchful, as if some part of him had finally decided the ground beneath them was safe enough to fully rest on. The weeks that followed the phone call with Colonel Acaffer settled into something Daniel hadn't expected to find twice in one lifetime, a second routine, layered over the first, built now around a question instead of just survival. He started walking Duke past the first Palmetto Trust every single day, sometimes twice, watching without watching, the old surveillance instincts from years spent clearing buildings in hostile territory, waking up slow and rusty inside him like a machine that hadn't run in a long time. Duke's behavior in front of the bank never wavered. Every single time, without fail, he would slow half a block out, ears coming up, nose lifting to test the air, and then plant himself directly in front of the same section of sidewalk near the bank's side entrance, the one used mostly by employees and armored car deliveries, and refused to move until Daniel physically walked him past it. He never barked, he never growled. He simply sat, patient and utterly immovable, nose angled down and slightly to the left, toward a grate in the sidewalk that Daniel eventually identified as ventilation for the building's basement level. "You're not just smelling old fry grease," Daniel murmured to him one gray afternoon, crouched down at Duke's level, studying the grate with the same slow, careful attention he'd once given to suspicious wiring in a compound doorway. "You're smelling something specific, something that matters to you." He thought at first that it might be nothing more than an old habit misfiring, a dog trained for years to alert on certain chemical signatures, perhaps catching some faint residual trace from whatever operation he'd once supported near a bank just like this one, some ghost of training triggering on nothing real at all. But the pattern was too consistent, too precise, too unwavering across 2 full weeks of daily walks for Daniel to keep dismissing it as coincidence. EOD training had taught him, above almost everything else, that patterns which repeat under controlled conditions are patterns worth taking seriously, and Duke's alert rapia. Ted exactly every single time, down to the angle of his nose and the specific 3 feet of sidewalk he refused to cross. He started asking around, carefully, the way he'd learned to gather intelligence in villages where the wrong question to the wrong person could get a man killed. He talked to a fellow veteran named Ortiz who panhandled 2 blocks over and who mentioned offhand that the bank had brought in an unusually large private security contractor about 6 weeks back, unusual for a regional trust bank that had never needed more than the standard armed guard rotation before. He talked to a woman who cleaned offices in the building next door, who mentioned, without any particular weight behind it, that she'd seen unmarked vans parked in the bank's loading dock at odd hours over the past month, well past when any legitimate business should have needed deliveries. He watched the bank staff carefully from a bench across the street where a homeless man with a scarred dog drew exactly 0 suspicion from anyone, and noticed after 4 days of patient observation that one man in particular, mid-50s, expensive suit that didn't quite fit the modest salary of a regional bank manager, name badge reading Wallace Thorne, vice president of facilities, left the building at odd hours, met briefly with unfamiliar men in the loading dock, and returned inside with the particular tension of a man carrying a secret, he didn't want anyone reading on his face. Daniel recognized that tension. He'd seen it on the faces of local nationals back in country, men caught between two impossible loyalties, walking a line they knew could collapse under them at any moment. Thorne had that same brittle, over-controlled quality to his movements, shoulders too square, stride too deliberate, the walk of a man performing calm rather than feeling it. He smoked exactly one cigarette every evening at 6:15, always alone, always facing away from the building's security cameras in a spot that Daniel clocked on the second day as a deliberate blind spot rather than a coincidence. Being invisible had its uses. Daniel had learned over 3 hard years on the street. People's eyes slid past him the way they slid past a lamppost or a mailbox, some unconscious social reflex that erased him from a stranger's field of concern the moment they registered the general shape of a man who didn't matter to their day. It had cost him more than he could measure, that invisibility, indignity, and in the small daily indignities of being looked past rather than looked at. But sitting on that bench, watching Wallace Thorne's careful, secretive evenings unfold in perfect view of a man nobody bothered to notice, Daniel understood, for the first time in a long while, that the same invisibility could be turned into something useful. Nobody suspects the surveillance of a man they've already decided isn't worth watching back. Funny thing about being nobody, he murmured to Duke one evening, watching Thorne stub out his cigarette and check his watch for the third time in as many minutes. Nobody ever thinks nobody's paying attention. Duke huffed softly in response, eyes fixed on Thorne with the same patient, assessing stillness he gave everything that mattered, and Daniel scratched behind the one good ear, grateful, not for the first time, that whatever had trained this dog had also apparently trained him never to break focus on a target worth watching. Daniel didn't have proof of anything yet, but he had 11 years of training telling him that something underneath that bank was wrong, and a dog whose nose had never once, in 4 straight weeks, given him reason to doubt it. It was Ortiz, in the end, who gave him the piece that turned suspicion into something closer to certainty. They were sharing a thermos of bad coffee one cold morning under the overpass, Duke stretched out between them with his head on Daniel's knee, when Ortiz mentioned, almost in passing, that his cousin worked maintenance in the bank's basement level and had complained, weeks back, about a section of the old vault sublevel being cordoned off for structural renovations that never seemed to actually involve any renovation crew showing up. Said it's weird, Ortiz added, blowing steam off his coffee. Said there's supposed to be inspectors down there, engineers, whatever, but all he ever sees is the same 3 guys, always at night, never in hard hats, moving equipment that don't look like construction gear to him. Said it spooked him enough he stopped taking that hallway if he could help it. Daniel sat very still, the old careful stillness of a man who has just heard something that changes the shape of a problem entirely. Your cousin's still working there. Far as I know. Would he talk to me? Ortiz shrugged. For a hot meal, probably. Man works 2 jobs and still can't make rent. He talked to God himself for a hot meal these days. Daniel used the last $12 he had tea. Owe his name to buy Ortiz's cousin, a soft-spoken man named Reggie Prout, dinner at a diner 2 nights later, and sat across from him with Duke curled quiet beneath the table, listening to a story that confirmed, piece by piece, everything the last month of careful watching had already suggested. Reggie described unmarked crates moved in after hours. Described a section of the sublevel sealed off with signage that never matched the actual bank permits filed with the city. Daniel had checked those permits himself, using the library computer, and found nothing on record authorizing any structural work at all. Described, most damning of all, a conversation he'd overheard entirely by accident between Wallace Thorne and one of the unfamiliar men, low and urgent, about needing the whole vault gone before the audit hits. a phrase that had meant nothing to Reggie at the time and meant everything, suddenly, to a former EOD technician who had spent a career listening for exactly that kind of language. "They're planning to destroy the vault," Daniel said quietly, more to himself than to Reggie, the pieces sliding into place with the cold, clean click of a puzzle finally resolving. "Not rob it, destroy it, before an audit can look inside it." "Destroy it how?" Reggie asked, uneasy now, clearly wishing he'd never brought any of it up. Daniel looked down at Duke, who lifted his head at the change in Daniel's voice and met his eyes with that same steady, patient assessment he'd been giving the world since the night Daniel found him behind the dumpster. "That," Daniel said, "is exactly what I intend to find out." Before he called Akaffer, though, Daniel tried the ordinary channel first, the way any reasonable citizen would have. He walked into the Charleston Police Department's non-emergency desk the next morning, Duke waiting patiently outside on his leash, tied to a bike rack, and tried to explain as calmly and clearly as he could manage what he'd pieced together: the sealed sublevel, the unmarked crates, the phrase about needing the vault gone before an audit. The desk sergeant, a heavy-set man with tired eyes who'd clearly heard every variety of conspiracy theory a city produces on a slow Tuesday, listened for about 90 seconds before his patience visibly ran out. "Let me get this straight," the sergeant said, not unkindly, but with the flat, weary tone of a man closing out a file before it opened. "Your dog won't walk past a bank, and that's evidence of a criminal conspiracy at a federally insured financial institution." "It's more than the dog," Daniel said. "I've got surveillance." "Sir, I appreciate your service, I do, but I can't open an investigation into a fortune-listed regional bank based on a stray dog's sidewalk habits and second-hand gossip from a maintenance worker. You understand how that sounds." Daniel understood exactly how it sounded. He'd have sounded the same way to himself, 3 years ago, in a different life, hearing this same story from a stranger with matted hair and a duffel bag. He didn't argue. He'd learned on the street that arguing with a closed door rarely opened it, and that the smarter move was almost always to find another door instead. He walked back out to the bike rack where Duke waited, untied him, and crouched down to scratch behind the one good ear. "They laughed," Daniel said quietly. "Not out loud, but they laughed. Fine, wouldn't be the first time nobody believed either one of us." Duke pressed his nose against Daniel's wrist, steady and certain, and Daniel understood, with the same clean clarity he'd once used to read a threat assessment, that being dismissed didn't make him wrong. It just meant he needed better proof, and a channel that actually had the authority and the will to use it. That was the afternoon he called Colonel Akaffer for the second time, no longer content to simply confirm Duke's history, but ready now to ask her for help building a case nobody in that department could laugh off. He called Colonel Akaffer again that night, laying out everything he'd gathered with the same clean, clinical precision he'd once used briefing officers before a clearance operation. The daily alerts at the same precise location, the unusual security contractor, the sealed-off sublevel with no matching permits, the overheard phrase about needing the vault gone before an audit. Akaffer listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she was quiet long enough that Daniel wondered if the call had dropped. "Sergeant Reyes," she said finally, "if what you're describing is accurate, you are looking at a financial institution's own leadership orchestrating the destruction of evidence ahead of a federal audit, likely to conceal fraud severe enough to warrant that level of risk. That is not a matter for you to handle personally. That is a matter for the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, today, not tomorrow." "I know," Daniel said. "I just don't have anybody who's gonna believe a homeless vet and his one-eared dog without something harder to hand them first." "Then let's get you something harder," Akaffer said, and the old command edge came back into her voice, sharp and certain. "I still have contacts. Give me a day." She called back within 18 hours, connecting him to a young FBI financial crimes agent named Priya Chen who listened to Daniel's account with far more patience and far less skepticism than Daniel had braced himself for, taking careful notes, asking sharp, specific questions about dates and names that told Daniel, within the first 5 minutes, that she was already tracking something adjacent to what he'd found, some thread of the same fraud from an entirely different angle. We've had First Palmetto Trust flagged for irregular reserve reporting for about 4 months, Chen admitted, more openly than Daniel expected from a federal agent talking to a stranger. We suspected internal manipulation of the books. We did not suspect they'd try to physically destroy the vault infrastructure itself to erase the evidence before our audit team gets access. That's a significant escalation, Sergeant. And it means whatever timeline they're working on, it may be shorter than any of us have room for. My dog's flagged that sidewalk grate every single day for a month, Daniel said. Consistent, precise. He's not wrong about things like this. He wasn't trained to be wrong. There was a pause on Chen's end, the sound of a keyboard, a low murmur of another voice consulting nearby. Can you get us confirmation on what's actually behind that sealed section without triggering anyone inside to move faster than they already are? Daniel looked down at Duke, asleep now against his leg, chest rising and falling in the slow, even rhythm of a creature finally getting something close to rest. I think, Daniel said slowly, my dog already gave you that confirmation. What I can get you is eyes on the loading dock, times, faces, plates, things a court's gonna want to see. Do it carefully, Chen said, and Sergeant, thank you. Most people would have walked past that dog and never looked back. The days that followed were the longest, most careful days of surveillance Daniel had run since his last deployment, conducted with nothing more than a park bench, a disposable phone with a camera, and a scarred, patient dog who never once broke character as anything other than a stray keeping a homeless man company. Daniel logged the comings and goings of the unmarked vans, 3 different times over 5 nights, capturing partial plates on 2 of them. He photographed Wallace Thorne meeting the same 2 unfamiliar men in the loading dock on 4 separate occasions, always after 11 at night, always with the particular hurried tension of men working against a clock they hadn't set themselves. He built a rapport, slow and careful, with the office cleaner from the building next door, a woman named Marisol Vega who worked the overnight shift and had noticed the vans long before Daniel ever asked her about them. She met him on her smoke breaks, cautious at first, until she understood he wasn't looking for trouble, only for the truth of what she'd already seen with her own eyes. They come Tuesdays and Thursdays mostly, she told him one night, cigarette smoke curling up into the humid dark, Duke sitting politely a few feet off, having long since earned her trust as thoroughly as Daniel had. Same 2 men, never in uniform, never carrying anything that looks like tools. One time I saw them carrying something wrapped in a moving blanket, heavy enough it took both of them. I didn't think much of it at the time. People move things at banks, I figured. Wasn't my business. Would you be willing to write down the dates you remember? Daniel asked. Just what you saw, nothing more than that. Marisol studied him a long moment, then studied Duke, who met her gaze with the same steady patience he gave everyone, and something in her posture eased. You're not some conspiracy nut, are you? You're actually onto something. I think I am, Daniel said. I just need enough of it written down that somebody with a badge has to take it seriously. She wrote him 3 pages of dates and times over the following week, precise and careful, the kind of plain, unembellished testimony that carries more weight in a courtroom than any dramatic account ever could. Daniel cross-referenced her dates against his own surveillance logs and found them matching almost perfectly, a pattern of Tuesday and Thursday night deliveries that lined up, disturbingly well, with the timeline Reggie had already described for the sealed sub-level work. By the time he brought all of it to Agent Chen, he wasn't handing her a hunch anymore. He was handing her a case. He passed everything to Agent Chen through Colonel Acaffer, careful never to make contact directly with the FBI office in a way that might draw attention from anyone watching the beat. Ank's exterior for exactly that kind of activity, and through all of it, Duke stayed close, alert in the particular quiet way Daniel had come to recognize as work rather than fear, ears up, body relaxed but ready, the calm competence of an animal doing exactly the job he'd been built for, 7 years after anyone had last asked it of him. "You'd have made a hell of a partner back in country," Daniel told him one cold night, watching a van pull away from the loading dock with its lights off until it cleared the block. "Guess you still are one, just a different war now." Duke huffed once through his nose in response and pressed his nose against Daniel's wrist, checking the pulse, the way he always did, and Daniel felt the steadiness of it settle something in his own chest that hadn't been steady in a very long time. Agent Chen called on the sixth night with news that changed everything. "We got a federal judge to sign off on an emergency inspection order based on the audit irregularities alone. Didn't even need to reference your surveillance directly, which keeps you out of any paperwork you don't want to be part of. But here's the problem, Sergeant. Our intelligence suggests they're moving up the timeline. We think they're planning to trigger whatever they've rigged down there within the next 48 hours, before our inspectors can get inside. If there's an actual explosive device involved, and not just a controlled structural collapse, we need someone who can assess that safely before we send an entry team in blind." "You want me to go in?" "I want you to consult," Chen said carefully. "As a former EOD technician with direct, current intelligence on this specific location, we'll have you flanked by federal agents the entire time. But if there's a device down there, Sergeant Reyes, you're the only person in this operation who's actually trained to look at it and tell us whether it's safe to approach." Daniel looked down at Duke, who met his eyes with the same steady patience he'd carried through every single day of the last month, and understood, with the clean certainty of a man returning to the only job he'd ever been fully good at, that there was only one answer he could give. "Then I'm going in," he said, "and so is he." They breached the sublevel 2 nights later, just past midnight, a coordinated federal entry team moving through the bank's rear service corridor with the practiced silence of people who did this for a living, Daniel walking near the center of the formation in a borrowed tactical vest 3 sizes too big, Duke moving at his side off-leash, nose working steady arcs across the corridor floor exactly the way he'd been trained to years before anyone in this building had ever heard his name. Agent Marsh had briefed him twice on the ride over, once for the formal record and once quieter man-to-man in the back of the unmarked van. "You don't have to do this, Sergeant. We can bring in a certified EOD unit from the Charleston field office. Might take an extra hour, but nobody would think less of you for stepping back." "An hour's a lot of runway when there's a timer involved," Daniel had answered, checking the fit of the vest with hands that, for the first time in longer than he could remember, weren't shaking at all. "I know this building's layout better than anyone you could call in cold, and Duke's already done half the targeting work for you. Be a waste not to finish it." Marsh hadn't argued further. He'd simply nodded, the particular nod of a professional recognizing another professional, however unlikely the uniform, and waved the team forward. The sealed section Reggie had described turned out to be a reinforced storage annex adjacent to the main vault, accessed through a service door that had been quietly rekeyed sometime in the last 6 weeks, the old lock cylinder still sitting, discarded, in a supply closet nearby, where Daniel's practiced eye caught it during the approach. Beyond the door, in a narrow concrete corridor lit only by the team's tactical lights, Duke slowed, then stopped entirely, dropping into the same tight, focused sit-alert Daniel had watched him perform on that sidewalk grate every single day for a month, nose locked on a service panel set into the wall roughly 10 feet from the vault's outer door. "That's it," Daniel said quietly, voice pitched low and flat, the same controlled cadence he'd once used calling target locations to a team clearing a compound. Whatever he's smelling, it's behind that panel. The team lead, a stocky agent named Marsh who'd clearly run more than a few of these operations, held up a fist, freezing the formation in place. "Talk to me, Sergeant." Daniel approached slow, methodical, the old muscle memory of a decade spent walking toward the things other men ran from settling over him like a coat he hadn't worn in years, but had never really taken off. He studied the panel without touching it, noting the fresh screws, slightly mismatched to the surrounding hardware, the faint chemical smell beneath the electrical, the kind of smell that meant something more sophisticated than a simple structural charge. "This isn't demolition grade," he said slowly, working through it out loud the way he'd been trained to, narrating for the team behind him the way he'd once narrated for a spotter. "This is precision. Small charge professionally placed, positioned to compromise the vault's structural integrity and the surrounding fire suppression system at the same time, which tells me whoever built this wanted it to look like an accident. A gas leak, a fire, something that destroys the paper trail inside that vault without ever raising the word sabotage in an insurance report." "Can you disarm it?" Marsh asked. Daniel looked down at Duke, who held his sit alert perfectly steady, patient as stone, exactly as he had every single day on that sidewalk above them. "I can," Daniel said, "but I need everyone but me and the dog out of this corridor first. If I'm wrong about the yield on this thing, I don't want anybody else paying for that mistake." Marsh hesitated only a moment before nodding, pulling his team back through the service door, leaving Daniel alone in the narrow concrete corridor with nothing but a headlamp, a borrowed multi-tool, and a scarred, one-eared dog who had somehow, against every reasonable likelihood, walked out of one war and straight into the middle of another, exactly where his training had always meant for him to be. "All right," Daniel murmured, kneeling in front of the panel, hands steadier now than they'd been in years, the old tremor gone entirely, burned away by the clean, total focus of a job he'd once believed he would never do again. "Let's see what you found for me, buddy." He worked the panel free with careful, unhurried movements, each motion deliberate, checked twice before committed to, the same discipline that had kept him alive through 2 deployments, now steadying his hands in a concrete basement half a world away from where he'd first learned it. Behind the panel, exactly as the smell and the wiring had suggested, sat a compact, professionally assembled incendiary device wired into both the vault's structural support and the building's suppression system, rigged on a timer that, when Daniel finally traced it fully, showed less than 3 hours remaining before detonation. His hands didn't shake once, not through the careful isolation of the trigger circuit, not through the slow, patient work of separating the timer from the charge, not through the final, silent moment when the device went dark and inert under his hands, and he sat back, breathing slow and even, in a corridor that would have gone up in flame and smoke within the hour if he hadn't been standing exactly where he was. Duke broke his sit alert only then, crossing the small distance between them to press his nose hard against Daniel's wrist, checking the pulse, the same gesture he'd made 100 times over the last month, except this time Daniel understood it wasn't comfort he was offering. It was confirmation, a job finished, a partner checking on his handler after the work was done, the same way he must have done it 100 times before, years ago, for a man whose name Daniel would probably never learn. "We're okay," Daniel told him, voice rough, one hand resting on the dog's scarred flank. "We're okay, Duke. Good boy, good boy." The arrests came fast after that. Wallace Thorne was taken into custody within the hour, along with 2 contractors identified through the surveillance footage and plate numbers Daniel had gathered over the previous week. And within days, the FBI's Financial Crimes Division had unraveled a fraud scheme running nearly 6 years deep, falsified reserve reports, a slow, patient siphoning of client trust funds routed through shell accounts, and a vault full of physical records that, had they burned as planned, would have erased the only hard evidence connecting Thorne and his partners to millions of dollars in stolen assets, evidence that federal auditors confirmed, once safely recovered, tied back to a fraud operation touching client accounts worth well over $200 million in total exposure. Agent Chen sat with Daniel the following afternoon in a quiet conference room at the field office, Duke curled beneath the table at his feet exactly as he had beneath the diner booth with Reggie weeks before, and walked him through the shape of what they'd found. Thorne wasn't acting alone, obviously, she said, sliding a folder across the table that Daniel didn't open, having no particular need to see it laid out in black and white when he'd already lived every piece of it from the outside. But he was the one who panicked hardest once the audit notice went out. That's usually how it goes. The man closest to the fraud is the one who does something desperate enough to get caught. And if Duke hadn't flagged that great, Dan, Yeel said, you'd have gotten a fire report instead of an indictment. We would have gotten a tragedy, Chen said flatly. That device was rigged to compromise the fire suppression system along with the structural support. Anyone working that sublevel overnight when it went off wouldn't have had much chance. You didn't just save a paper trail, Sergeant. You very likely saved lives. Daniel didn't have much to say to that. He looked down at Duke instead, who lifted his head just enough to meet Chen's eyes with that same steady, unblinking assessment he gave everyone new, and Chen, to her credit, didn't look away from it. He's a remarkable animal, she said quietly. He's a better man than most men I've served with, Daniel said. No offense to the men. Word got around Charleston, the way it always does in a city that size, faster than any official statement could keep pace with. Ortiz told half the shelter within a week, and Reggie Prout, no longer quite so afraid of losing his job now that the men who'd frightened him were in federal custody, told the rest. A local television station ran a segment that Daniel reluctantly agreed to, mostly because the Veterans Outreach Coordinator who arranged it reminded him, gently, that other veterans sleeping under other overpasses might hear his story and remember that their own instincts and their own dogs were worth trusting even when nobody else believed them yet. He kept the interview short, uncomfortable in front of the camera in a way he'd never been uncomfortable diffusing an actual device, and made sure, every time a reporter asked him to take credit, to redirect at least half of it toward the dog sitting calm and steady at his feet. People laughed at him, Daniel told the reporter, the same flat, quiet certainty he'd used explaining the incendiary device to Marsh's team. Grown men in suits, laughing at a scarred old dog for sitting on a sidewalk. He wasn't wrong once. Not once, in a month of testing him without even meaning to. I just wish it hadn't taken almost losing a building for anybody besides me to notice. A K9 forensics review confirmed Duke's identity off residual chip data beneath old scar tissue at his shoulder, closing out a 4-year missing designation with a single line in a database that had, for too long, simply marked him as unaccounted for. The government offered Daniel a reward tied to the federal asset forfeiture guidelines for the recovery of the funds Thorne's scheme had been about to erase enough once it cleared, to put both him and Duke into a small rented house on the edge of town with a fenced yard and a roof that didn't leak. He signed the paperwork without much ceremony, the same way he signed most things now, quiet and unhurried, a man who had learned the hard way not to trust good news until it had actually landed. The thing he cared about more in the end came through a different set of forms entirely. Colonel Acaffer's formal request, filed on his behalf, for Daniel to be granted official adoptive handler status for a retired working dog whose full record, once fully restored, made the honor exactly his to claim. The approval came 6 weeks later, on a quiet Tuesday morning, and Daniel read it standing on the porch of a house that was, for the first time in over 3 years, actually his. Approved, it read, K9 designation Duke is hereby honorably retired from federal service and formally adopted to civilian handler Daniel Reyes, effective immediately. Daniel folded the letter carefully and sat down on the porch steps, and Duke came and lay across his feet, warm and solid and entirely unafraid, and together they watched the sun climb over a fenced yard that belonged fully and only to the two of them. Colonel Acaffer drove down from North Carolina the following month, ostensibly to deliver Duke's restored service records in person, though both she and Daniel understood the visit was really about something else entirely. She stood in the yard a long while, watching Duke cross open grass without a trace of the old wariness, watching him roll once, fully, onto his back in a patch of warm sun, belly bared to a world he no longer needed to watch for danger. "I've placed a lot of dogs with a lot of handlers over the years," she said, quiet, something unmistakably moved beneath her usual brisk professionalism. "Most of them take months before they trust an open yard like that. Some of them never do." "Took him some time," Daniel said. "Took me some too, if I'm honest." "Looks like you both got there." Acaffer studied Daniel a moment longer, taking in the steadiness of his stance, the hand that no longer trembled the way it had the first time she'd heard his voice over the phone. "You look like a man who stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop, Sergeant." "Some days I'm still waiting," Daniel admitted, "just fewer of those days than there used to be." A neighbor's wind chime rang somewhere down the block, and Duke lifted high. S head at the sound, listened a moment with the mild, unbothered curiosity of a dog checking in on the world rather than bracing against it, then settled his head back down into the grass with a long, contented sigh. Acaffer laughed softly at that, and Daniel found himself laughing too, easy and unguarded, the sound of two people who had each, in their own way, spent a career walking toward the things other people ran from, and had finally, both of them, found a little peace on the other side of it. Ortiz came by that same week with a case of beer he couldn't really afford, insisting on celebrating properly, and Reggie Prout drove over from his new job, a straightforward maintenance position at a building with no secrets buried in its basement, just to see the yard for himself and shake Daniel's hand one more time. Marisol Vega sent a card in the mail, simple and handwritten, thanking him for believing her when a police sergeant hadn't been willing to. Daniel kept it taped inside a kitchen cabinet where he'd see it most mornings, a small, steady reminder that the people who'd taken him seriously had mattered every bit as much as the ones who hadn't. "We did all right," Daniel said quietly that evening, scratching behind the ear Duke had left, the tremor in his own hand finally, blessedly still. "We did all right, buddy." Duke pressed his nose against Daniel's wrist one more time, checking the pulse the way he always did, and this time, for the first time, it felt less like a medic confirming a patient was still breathing, and more like an old friend simply glad to be sitting beside him in the quiet, the war behind both of them at last, the only thing left to guard now being a peace they'd both fought too hard to give up. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved me telling it, do something for me, hit that like button, and if you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Drop a comment and let me know what part hit you hardest, because I read every single one of them. And if you know someone who needs a reminder that loyalty like this still exists, send this one their way. Until next time, take care of each other and take care of the ones who served.